Okay, Dr. Orley Ashenfelter, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to meet with you. On my wall right here is the Broad Street Pump by John Snow, who you share something in common with, which is the discovery of the difference in differences design. And it's really an honor to get to meet you and talk to you.
I'm glad you know about the Snow story. That was first circulated amongst economists, I think, by the statistician. Died
David
pretty young. He was, now died pretty young. Now was at Berkeley. Very interesting guy, but he had his own. He made a lot of people angry for reasons that he didn't have to. I've never understood.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. He had many. Where the controversy in statistics was at the time was about imputation in the census. In fact, this whole thing has come up again. And if you notice, this week, the Census Bureau with John Aboud, who's the chief scientist there, a terrific guy, who I worked with and who was at Princeton at one time also in the industrialization section. They designed the census so they could try to estimate the undercount for various groups. And I listened last night to the PBS NewsHour discussion of this, which at least they had something. But of course, they didn't answer the simple question: is it was presented as if, well, if you knew there were 4 million Hispanics undercounted, why didn't you count them? The whole point is we didn't know that. This was a good design. It was a beautifully designed way to figure out an estimate of what the undercount might have been using the system that we used.
Yeah.
So they completely missed the point, unfortunately, which is sad because I'm afraid as a comment more broadly on the role of economics and statistics, and that's what he was concerned about is imputation and things like that. That's where statisticians get controversial.
Right. David Friedman.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. Yeah, his book, I used to teach it. That's also where I learned about Snow for the first time. I think now with COVID, we all kind of know about him a lot more.
Yeah, he that's right. He really popularized the Snow thing. You're exactly right. As a sort of it was a kind of a tweak of economists and other social scientists too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so I kind of wanted to talk about two things. I kind of wanted to talk about your life, your professional life, and sort of your career. And then also I had some questions about economics that I just wanted to kind of just sort of have a chat about. So it seems like Princeton in the 70s and the 80s was a real fertile ground for some sort of revolution in empirical micro. And in my mind, it starts with you and Albert Reese. And I was just wondering what impact he had on you as a young economist, and how do you think you would have been different, if at all, had you not been known him?
Al Reese was he had moved from Chicago and for personal reasons really, but he fit in perfectly at Princeton, and of course he ultimately had other positions. He was a provost of the university and so on. He was a very gentle, open-minded man. I don't know that I've ever met anybody quite as open-minded about things. And he was also extremely empirically oriented, although he knew economic theory. He has a really nice paper about sort of a Harburger style dead weight loss of trade unions. And it basically shows it's not very big. But he was very encouraging. So he let people do what they want. I took my own style from that. So I've never tried to. I like to make sure students are working on problems that might be useful for them to work on. But other than that, I try not to be too forceful about how they do it. He had just come off of a book, which it's completely lost, that people don't know about anymore. It was one of the very first empirical studies of labor markets. He did it with, of all people, George P. Shultz, the famous George Shultz, who was Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and just died recently at 100. They were great friends. And what they did was to collect data from individual firms and then study wage determination using a regression design. So he kind of already, when he arrived at Princeton, he was still trying to finish that work. It did finally come out, but he was a real pioneer in that regard, and is completely unknown today. I mean, in that work, I mean, in a sense, because it was one of the very first, well, it might have been the first use of modern econometric tools on microdata collected by the authors from individual firms.
Wow. That's, I didn't know it was their own collection of it.
Yeah, they collected the data. They had to get access, they focused on pretty narrow occupations, like, well, key punch operators, which of course nobody even knows what those are anymore.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
I guess, well, in the old days, you had to sit in front of a typewriter and punch data into cards, and then the cards went into the computer. And so, today we bypass all that, but
yeah, right.
It was a real job at one time.
Wow. And so his impact on you, what was it like, being associated with him? What influence did you feel like you changed because of?
Well, he had some strong, I'll tell you, he was very responsible for studies work on economics of discrimination. He actually had, Becker had been at Chicago as a student when Reese was there, and Becker had worked on that topic. But there was also, Becker relied in his little book, Economics of Discrimination, on a PhD thesis, which had been written in Chicago about male-female wage differences. So it's no accident that Ron Oaxaca of the famous Oaxaca decompositions was a student of Al's, and that Al, wanted him to work on this kind of topic. I could be helpful because I actually understood how the regression system worked pretty well, so we could do it. But he was very interested, and we had a conference, was quite a blue chip deal in its time, on the economics of discrimination. So he had some topics he was very passionate about, and that was one, race and sex discrimination. Wow. So that influenced me and others, I think.
When was that? What year was that?
Well, let's see. My dissertation was on economics of discrimination, with some very surprising results. And that would have been, I forget when he arrived at Princeton. It would have been, maybe 67, maybe 1967.
Huh.
Yeah, he was quite, but he had his, he also had his sights set on he ended up, he went to work at the Council on Wage and Price Stability, which was kind of an amusing thing to do with Gerald Ford, and then ended up as provost at Princeton, and of course, finally as president of the Mellon Foundation. I think he kind of felt, he's not the only one, he kind of felt that the way that the technical requirements in economics, technical skills, that he had been trained in the 40s, 30s and 40s, and I think he felt that the technical things that were being done were kind of moving too fast for him.
Oh, really? Wow. What's the technical stuff? The neoclassical modeling?
Well, instrumental variables and all that, the usual kind of, you have to remember that the textbooks that really brought econometrics to economics were by Johnson and Goldberger, and they weren't published until 1964. So, people like me cut their teeth on those books, but that would not have been available. In fact, even the way we teach micro using calculus, that was not common. I mean, in the old days, it's sort of amazing to meet sometimes these economists who can actually work through analyses of demand and supply without using any mathematics. I'm not even sure I could do it.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. Well, I was wondering about, I think a lot about the influence of these job training programs that you had studied, and then, it going into
Well, that was a kind of an epiphany for me. That was a special moment, and I think Card refers to this actually in his Nobel lecture. But the guy who's tracked this down is Neto in his PhD thesis. This Brazilian guy, he has really tracked that down. What happened to me was very simple. I just gotten tenure at Princeton, and George Shultz had been Secretary of Labor. Most people don't know this, in the first Nixon administration. And he brought in, without a doubt, the finest people ever to serve in the positions in that department. Arnold Weber, who subsequently became president of Northwestern, was in the Manpower Administration, as they called it then. The Solicitor General had been at the Red Cross. I mean, it was a fantastic group of people, and including Michael Moskow, who was my boss, it turned out, ended up as president of Chicago Fed. Anyway, there was a guy named Farber, not Hank Farber, I think his name was David Farber, who had really cracked, I think, the code, in the sense that people wanted to evaluate the effect of training programs, but how do you get data to do that? What he had done is actually, he had, like as if he were in school, each trainee was linked by their social security number. And Farber was a guy who, I'm not sure who got a hold of him. He was at the Social Security Administration. And he knew how, this is the same technique, by the way, that Angrist used when he studied the Vietnam draft. So this guy Farber had managed to figure out how to get the data from on Social Security records for trainees. So, and had the continuous work history sample as well for a potential control group. So I was presented with the option to go to Washington. I had to be a bureaucrat there. I was director of something called the Office of Evaluation. But what really attracted me was the fact that this guy had really produced data that no one had ever seen in any environment anywhere before. It's a complete new thing, right? So we actually had longitudinal data on individuals. We could see exactly what happened to them. And also we had potentially a control group from the continuous work history sample. So I went there with an undergraduate who subsequently got a PhD at MIT. And we did the first early work on training programs. There are two papers that came out of that are quite important that most people are not aware of. One is the 1978 paper that you mentioned in RE Stat, Review of Economic Statistics. By the way, that was turned down by a lot of other journals. At least the American Economic Review, I remember, which I subsequently edited and certainly would have accepted if I'd been the editor. That paper, and then there was a second paper where preliminary results were shown, which is really obscure. It's in the Proceedings of the Industrialization Research Association. And in that paper, I actually proposed using randomized trials. And pointed out, there's a subsequent paper called The Case for Randomized Trials and Training Programs. But this was really the first time I think anybody had proposed that this was, we had the data collection system. We just didn't have the randomization you need. And I had come to think, after working with these data for quite a while, that the complexity of the control group that you needed was really beyond anything that I could do without randomization. In fact, that was demonstrated pretty conclusively by Bob Lalonde in his now unfortunately gone in his paper and PhD thesis. So that was, for me, that was a great moment. And of course the differences came about in a very simple way. Here I am running regressions with hundreds of thousands of observations, fixed effects for individuals, fixed effects for time periods, which is a very powerful design. And I'm trying to present this to other people in the labor department and around the government. And you walk in and say the word regression analysis, and people's eyes glazed over. So I realized after the first time I presented this work that you can't use that word. So I started to think, well, what are we doing here? And I realized since we had a balanced longitudinal sample, we were just taking a difference and subtracting off a difference. And it was just a difference in differences. So it wasn't, I mean, it was a regression. I did it with regressions, right? You never actually calculated differences except to show people. So it was designed as a very simple, transparent way to show. I mean, everybody could understand. Okay, you calculate this average and this average, you subtract them. Then you take this average and this average, subtract them, and then you subtract the two. So we have 3 subtractions in a bunch of averaging. Anybody can do that. And of course, it's an extremely powerful design. Now everybody uses it, of course, and it came to be called that, difference in differences. It's hard for me to say where that really entered. I mean, Card remembers the time that I first started saying that, and I guess it was probably when I came back from the government. We were still trying to get people to understand. What's another thing to remember is that the idea of having micro data with person effects and year effects, that was pretty demanding. I mean, there's not very many data sets where you could do that.
When did you start to wrap your head around this parallel trends assumption that's become so central in the diff and div?
Yes. Well, let me just explain how that comes about. If you look at the 78 paper, the parallel trends is kind of a silly way to put it. I don't know. I forgot who came up with that phrase, but here's what we did. Okay. I had several years of data prior to each trainee's entering the training program. Okay, so let's say you enter the program in 1964. I have data on you in 63, 62, 61, 60. Okay. Now, if the simple difference in differences works, then it should be the case. If I take now let's say the after period is 1965. Let's just say that, okay? We're going to leave 64 out because you're in training. So I take the difference between your pay in 65 and 63 for the trainee group, and I take the difference in pay 65 and 63 in the continuous work history sample, and I take that difference, okay? And I get an estimate of the training effect. Now, let's do it again. If that training effect is estimated accurately without a specification bias, then I should be able to take 65 minus 62 and do that for the trainee group. And that should give me the same answer. Okay. Suppose it doesn't give me the same answer. Then I know there's something wrong with the difference of differences program. So what I did actually it was clear in the data I had at that time, it was quite clear that if you use the difference between 63 and 65, because there was a big dip from 62 to 63, you'd get a quite different answer from if you took from 62 to 65. And it did stabilize in that data I had then, it stabilized. So if you took, instead of taking 63, you took 62, 61, or 60, basically you got the same effect. So it seemed more likely that the assumption that the difference was stationary and that there wasn't. So the point here, Heckman actually pointed this out first, is that in the longitudinal data, you can imagine that selection takes place on permanent effects. Okay, if selection takes place on permanent effects, that makes life very simple, because then you can use the difference 63 to 65. But but let's suppose that it takes place on overall effects. So I'm going to select on people's incomes. It's got a permanent component and a transitory component. Okay. If the transitory component is serially uncorrelated, okay, then if you just ignore the period 63, go to 62, okay, that assumption about earnings means that it will be that all the differences from 62 to 65, 61, 65, so they will all be the same. All right. The key is there's two things. One is, and this is all laid out, by the way, in subsequently, Card and I did a paper. I've forgotten when that is, in the 80s, I think. That's all laid out. So basically, the selection divides. There's two things going on. There's the selection, and then because you're using longitudinal data and you're using a person to control it for themselves, there's also this question of what the earning structure is. In other words, can the earning structure be described as just a permanent effect and a transitory effect, which is serially uncorrelated, or is it a permanent effect plus a transitory effect, which is serially correlated, but only one, with the order 1 with the serial correlation, order 2, or so those two things, in order to use that method, you really need to be able to say, to identify both those things.
Uh-huh.
That's extremely demanding. And so I thought, well, randomization makes some sense. And in fact, the Labor Department did sponsor a randomized training program. A randomized program for studying the effects of trainees. Subsequently, I was not involved in that. But in fact, Heckman was involved in it. He got interested in it too. But yes, it became a kind of so the parallel trends thing is kind of silly, because what it really means is, if you take enough differences, are they all the same answer?
Mm-hmm.
It's really what you're after.
Yeah.
And it should be linked to what you think is the selection program, as well as the underlying. So that's not the way people do it very much, but that's what we originally did.
I see.
Maybe I made that too complicated, but if you look at the two papers, you'll see those two papers together more or less explain this in great detail.
Yeah. That's so interesting that you were championing physical randomization decades before this randomization explosion happened. What was that controversial, or was it just?
Well, it you know who favored the I had good experience with Art Goldberger. So the problem, when you're in the government, and this, by the way, is no different from what you face now in clinical trials. The first problem you had, and I had an answer for this, was there are two. So typically, the objections came from the people who operate the programs, the first objection was, well, we know training is great. We can't deny someone access to training.
Right.
Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is, we didn't have enough money to give everybody training who wanted it. Oh. So I said, well, okay, I understand that. That's fine. So when we select, what fairer way is to select than to do it randomly? So actually, that's in the paper. I put that in the paper. That old paper, it says exactly that. Right. The other objection, which Goldberger had really handled, was, well, let's suppose that we think some people in the people that want to be trained are more likely to benefit from it than others. Mm-hmm. I said, well, look, as long as we select on ex ante factors, we don't have to have the same number of people. And we could create for the control group and the treatment group groups that, based on some objective characteristic you can give me. Now, it can't be a non-objective characteristic, which of course a lot of times they want to say, well, I know who's going to benefit from this program, even though I can't explain to you why. No, that's not, you can't do that. You have to be able to explain why. You can explain why. Then what we can do is set up these groups, and we can have different fractions of people go into the training program in them. So if you have say group 1, highly beneficial, we'll put 90% of them in the training program. As long as we have a control group, we can still look at it. This, by the way, this whole idea then was picked up in the negative income tax experiments, because they did that same. I mean, they did an extremely complicated version of what was going on there. But the person behind that really was Art Goldberger, who just worked out that the cost of not randomizing. So this is actually in the paper too. So if you ask yourself, you don't have to put the same number of people in the control group as the treatment group. So why do we want to put the same number in the treatment group? And the reason is because of power. Right. All right. The sampling error of the difference is minimized when it's 50-50. I haven't had the formulas actually in there in the paper, and I know that it was used because the Manpower Demonstration Corporation was set up. Bob Solo was on the board, and I had sent him the paper, and they were basically making that point. That was a company just devoted really to randomization. I don't know if you know that. There was a whole company devoted to randomization before anybody had a gleam in their eye that randomization was common, but it was quite common in various kinds of training programs starting in the 80s.
Wow. So in labor, what did the journals and the referees think with you physically randomized? Were they?
Well, it's no accident that the Industrial and Labor Relations, this paper is in the proceedings of the IRA because there's no referee.
Oh, that's so cool.
It was easy for me to get that published, no problem. Of course, that thing is not even in JSTOR, I don't think. I'm not even sure that those papers they're so inaccessible. And then, and of course, the organization changed its name. It's no longer the proceedings of the IRA, it's the proceedings of the LERA. So, I mean, it's just extremely obscure. I mean, everybody that was working in the area back in the day knew about it. One way that we made that true was in the Labor Department. This is a very funny story, by the way, which I'm perfectly happy to tell you and have others know about. But very wonderful people were brought into the Labor Department. I mean, George Johnson, Ernie Strom, a lot of great people that were, Dan Hammermensch, all these people were in the Labor Department at one time or another as a result of this thrust that had really been created in part by the people that George Shultz had brought in. Anyway, I wanted to have a working paper series that we could use to circulate around the government. So we called them technical analysis papers, right? That technical right away means no one's going to pay attention. So someone would ask me, I'd go give a talk, and they'd say, why are you? Okay, I'd say today, George Johnson came up with it. He was such a joker. I said, today I'm going to be talking about tap number 3. And they'd say, tap number 3. Yeah, I said, in the Labor Department, we actually know how many taps we have, unlike the Justice Department. It was a Nixon administration, and they were doing wiretaps and nobody knew about it. So I say, unlike the Justice Department and the Labor Department, we act. Now imagine that was in the government. I said, this,
yeah,
right. Nobody objected. It was perfectly okay. A lot of the people in the government at that time were really extraordinary people. They had come in during the 30s when federal government jobs you could pick out the very best people.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't know this, but even people like Samuelson and Friedman worked for the federal government in the Second World War.
Yeah.
He was actually a statistician originally.
Yeah, I remember reading that. When in my brain, Princeton as a department, the industrial relations and labor group in the 70s and 80s was just this, this ground zero for a real, revolution that changed all empirical micro, arguably. And there's this quote that I remember. I'm not going to get it right, but a journalist went up to Dizzy Gillespie and said, why did you set out to create bebop? And Gillespie said, I didn't set out to create anything. I was just making music. And so I was kind of curious, was it ever the case in Princeton in the 70s or 80s where you sort of felt like we're sort of a different department and we're doing different things that you could feel was important?
Well, it wasn't. No, I think Dizzy Gillespie nailed it.
Yeah.
I think we're doing what we thought we should do. It is true. The thing about Princeton is a lot of people don't know. The industrial relations section actually spanned more than one department. It dates back to the 1920s. It predates the department. The Department of Economics at Princeton was not created until 1960.
Oh,
it was originally a Department of Economics and Sociology. And the university at that point decided there should be a separate department. I mean, Princeton still has, for example, we don't have a Department of French. We have a Department of Romance Languages. And it has in it not just French speakers, but people from, it's been split up a little bit now, but I think the French and Italians are in the same department. They call themselves that, French, even if they're not from Italy or France. So there was the industrial relations section had been well financed, had been endowed, and it was going really before the department. And it created a kind of a umbrella with very good financing. I mean, we brought in money from the government too, but it created a financial umbrella so that people were able to really do what they wanted. It's still true, by the way, and not have to be too concerned about where the money comes from. if you want to collect data or do something. So it's not an accident that a lot of people were willing and able to start collecting data who were connected with it, because we didn't have to worry about where we were going to get the money from. We had a place to get it from. Alan Kruger, in fact, started our survey research center. Yeah, we have a survey research center that still survives, and he started it. It does a lot more than just labor economics, of course, many other things. And of course, there are a lot of data collection enterprises. So yeah, with Dizzy Gillespie had it right. But the historical setup was also we were physically separate. We were in the Firestone Library.
Right.
So it was like a laboratory set apart. And the number of good students who came out of there is simply phenomenal.
Yeah.
I mentioned Bob Lalonde, but there were many others, John DiNardo, Janet Curry, Ron Oaxaca, it was my first PhD student, really. These were all very distinguished people. Josh Angrist, of course, came. Well, I knew him from when he was an undergraduate.
Yeah.
So there were lots of people who came in there, and really financing was not an issue. The problem is you had to work, right? And it's not enough. Just because you have data, there's a lot more involved. So it was a very hotbedded place. But let's also remember, we were picking low-lying fruit in a way. I mean, I still remember people publishing papers where they used instrumental variables and didn't tell you what the instruments were.
Oh, wow.
Quite common.
Wow. Yeah.
Somehow it was like magic.
The good old days.
Yeah. Yeah, instrumental variables and it's magic, right? It solves this problem now. So now we no longer have to worry about endogeneity. Because, so there was low-lying fruit. The standards in the everybody in labor economics, an example I often give is when Card and Kruger did their paper on the minimum wage. The thing about that paper that's so valuable is the fact that it was so well designed, right? I mean, they went in the field before the actual law had been changed. But remember, it's just fast food chains, not including McDonald's in New Jersey. It doesn't cover very many people. And yet it had this influence, I think, because of the design.
Yeah.
And but most labor economists, now not others, but most labor economists, when the results came out, well, we can't find a very big effect, that didn't surprise anybody.
Oh, really? That was not surprising?
No, because most of the work that had been done before that was so poor.
Oh.
It was so poor that everybody knew that nobody had any. In fact, one of the reasons that Card and I had done an earlier paper, it was kind of a similar design. The paper has never been published. It exists. It's out there. We did one where what we did was to take, I think it was from the national, I forget which longitudinal data set, but from one of them. And what we did is we took people who were in the year before the federal minimum wage increased, were below the minimum, and then had data on them after that to see whether or not there was any effect. We couldn't find any effect in that. It's an old paper long before. So I don't think very many, nobody was terribly shocked because everybody knew the work prior to that was so poor.
Yeah.
There hadn't been any convincing work. And so I think what Card and Kruger had in mind, Card in particular, was that they should do something which it would be convincing. Right. And then, of course, if it had turned out that they found an employment effect, then it would have shown up in every textbook.
Right.
But it turned out they didn't find an employment effect. And so suddenly every principles teacher in America who, when they teach labor demand, only has one application, is kind of up the creek without a paddle.
Yeah. That is so interesting. Well, so I think about, it's like the Holy Trinity of Alan Kruger, David Card, and Josh Angrist. And I was just curious, if you wouldn't mind telling me, what are some of your best memories about them as student and faculty and colleagues? What do you think made them sort of stand out?
We were all in the same, we were all in this section in the library. So everybody was kind of thrown together. There were other people in there too. Cecilia Rouse, for example, now the chairman of the CEA, who I did a paper with. We wrote a paper with twins. We went to Twinsburg together. Using twins as a data set, that was a data collection. I did it first with Alan Kruger, and then we continued it CCNI. There were lots of people there, and graduate students always had offices in amongst. So Angrist was a graduate student when he was there. And everybody had basically, when he was at Princeton, he was working on this Vietnam draft lottery. You know, a lot of people don't know this. David Bradford, who was on the Council of Economic Advisors, he wrote his PhD thesis written about the draft lottery, basically about the design of it. He was a theorist. So many of us knew about the draft lottery. So there were lots of examples. We used to have, Mike Ransom was there. He was a graduate student there too. Mike Ransom is at BYU, just retired. We used to have, for example, we had a little red light. I never forget this. All of us had tried to estimate labor supply functions. Really, it's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
You don't have good experiment. Most data sets that you get don't generate a good experiment for you.
Right.
In any event, I'll tell you a funny story. We had a little red light, and there was a sign, and there was a room in which you went in to do work on your. Back in those days, you weren't using laptops. None of that work was done on laptops. There were no laptops.
Right.
So we would go into we had a little kind of a computer room, which had keyboards, and you could sit down and crunch some numbers. And that room had a glass entryway, and we had this red light, and there was a sign on it that said, you're supposed to turn this light on when you were estimating labor supply functions. And then the sign said, warning, when the red light is lit, dangerous estimation is going on of labor supply functions. That was the red light. Or Angrist, I remember he the first people to use this draft lottery design were here in San Francisco at UCSF. And they were interested in post-traumatic stress syndrome. Oh. So they basically used the design to study mental health of military people that had been likely to serve in the military. And I heard about that. Angrist got onto it. And of course, then he came out here he actually visited out here in San Francisco, the guys that had been doing this. And then when he came back, he was, he would be, his office, you'd hear blasting out of it, heard it on the grapevine, one of the great Vietnam War tunes. He kind of got into the San Francisco vibe when he met these doctors, I think, because they were using the same kind of experimental method. There were stories like that.
So I was also going to ask you a little bit about your AER editorship. What do you think? How do you feel that you're being editor at the AER? How do you feel like it changed, sort of made this new type of econometrics more streamlined, standardized, acceptable to economists as a whole? Would you say that's true, or would you say?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if you know how the AER, when I took it over, had just an incredible burden of papers. And one editor they could never possibly even try to read all the papers that they were going to try to publish. So what I did was to organize this co-editing system. Oh. So it never happened until then. Oh, wow. The co-editing system was, and we designed it as a freestanding. So I wanted very good people to do it. So I had my friend John Taylor. I wanted him to handle the macro. I've forgotten. I maybe asked, John Riley. I wanted him to handle the theory. And I wanted Bob Haveman to handle the public finance. These are names that are still people that are around, but they're not very active anymore. And the first thing I learned was that, I had it in mind, you may accept the paper, but I'll have the ultimate say. And I realized when I asked them if they would do it, they wouldn't even consider doing it under those circumstances. So the whole thing was decentralized. There were 4 editors. All I did was to decide where the papers went. And I did that mainly based on the fields. Right. I think it influenced everybody who was a co-editor in those days. Like Paul Milgram, for example, was one of the co-editors. Mm-hmm. Nobel Prize last year, year before last. I think it influenced him because it gave him access to a kind of broad variety of papers, and we took it pretty seriously. The editing was real. In other words, we didn't just rely on referees. I'm afraid the system now is kind of so decentralized that it's really fighting your way through the referees without there being any editorial supervision.
Right.
I mean, I still remember papers where I remember one in particular. In fact, he talks about it, George Borjas. His paper on like applying the Roy model to immigration.
Yeah.
That was sent to the AER, and the two referees, one of them was vivid about how bad it was. The other one thought it was very interesting. And I read the paper and I thought, well, this is no one has actually applied the Roy model and explained what its implications are for immigration. It was quite an important paper. But it's pretty clear that if I just listened to the referees, we would have rejected at least one of the referees. So there was a sense in which we actively edited, but it didn't mean that, I only handled certain papers, I did handle some papers, surprisingly, in fields that I didn't normally work on, in which subsequently I actually did do some work. And the good example is industrial organization. There weren't that many papers in that area. And there had to be a residual claimant, right? So you got theory, macro, public finance, what's left?
Right.
Somebody's got to deal with it.
Yeah.
That was a good experience for me. It took a lot. I think it was probably harmful to my own research agenda. It took too much time. But I do think it may be the most influential journal of its time. And I think probably influenced the way journals operate in general. But I'm always amazed that people talk to me and say something to me about, oh, yes, and of course, he was the editor of the AER. Well, I haven't been editor of the AER for 25 years.
Yeah.
That was I'm amazed anybody remembers it. Does anybody remember who the editor of any other journal was then? No, I'm sure they don't.
Right.
So it was influential, I think. But it was, a lot of mistakes were made. The biggest one was that we probably should have started more journals, which of course subsequently they did.
Right. The Ashenfelter dip. So I was wondering about the story about that a little bit more. If you've already covered it, I didn't say it explicitly for people.
Yeah, well, Heckman coined that phrase, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I didn't coin that phrase. He coined that phrase. Well, he was fascinated by it because he understood, as an econometrician, this idea that you have to model a selection and you have to model the earnings structure at the same time.
Right.
That was fascinating. He came up with an estimator that I still think was brilliant. His idea was that if you had let's say that you didn't know exactly what the status was, but let's say that you had a symmetric serial correlation in the error term of the earnings function. Suppose it was symmetric, right? What that would mean is that if there was a selection on income, there would be a selection and there would be a downward. Things would be below what you'd expect. But of course, the earnings nearby that one would also be lower than you'd expect. So what he figured out was, well, if it's symmetric, that means the earnings after the program and the earnings before the program, even though we don't understand exactly how that works, they're nevertheless symmetric. So we could take a standard difference.
Yeah.
So his idea was, if the training wasn't 64, let's take 66 versus. So the simple-minded way would be you take 65 versus 63. But you could also say, and that is a standard difference, but of course, if that selection was based on 63, it wouldn't work. But you could take 66 versus 62, take that difference, take the centered difference. That was his idea. I thought it was a very clever potential solution. Unfortunately, the correlation was so complicated that it didn't really work very well, because that also has a specification test. So the so-called trends deal, that's really I guess you understand that when I explained that the base level for the difference should be the same no matter which base level. The difference should be the same regardless of the base level you take. That's basically a specification test of the difference in differences model. And so this was another way to try to do it. But you get a test because if you have enough longitudinal data, if the symmetric differences are not the same, then it also means there's something wrong with the structure that you're designing. The specification test was failed.
Yeah.
That's really the parallel trends thing. Is really just I think it's another way to call it a specification test, but it's not really about trends. It doesn't have to be trends.
Right. Well, this is the last question I have. What do you think of as your most important work versus what you regard as your favorite work, if they're different, of your career?
Well, my favorite paper is, it's in a way it was very important, but nobody knows about it. My favorite paper, I still think it was a paper I loved doing, and I was so surprised and happy about it. It was in my dissertation, actually. It was the effect of trade unions on racial income differences. And up to that time, trade unions often got a rap, especially from the New York Times, which had very strong trade unions. The printing presses were run by a trade union, International Typesetters. And that paper, I had microdata for the first time that actually, so up until about 1967, you could not identify in microdata whether someone belonged to a union. There had been a huge fight up to that time about how many union members there were. In other words, unions wanted to claim there were a lot of members. People who didn't like unions wanted to claim there weren't very many members, and so on. They had a fight about this. The long, old story. And the way that the fraction of union membership was judged was, well, the unions collect dues. That's one way to do it. And the other way was the unions tell you how many members they have, which led to a higher number, it turned out. Well, in 1967, the Office of Economic Opportunity arranged to have the question asked on the CPS, do you belong to a union? So it was the first time anybody could actually do a very simple thing. Just count.
Yeah.
How many Black people belong to unions and how many white people belong to unions? It's just count. We're not going to do anything complicated here. All we're going to do is ask, what's the fraction of Black workers unionized? What's the fraction of white workers unionized? Is it the case, as many in the media say, that there are no Black workers in unions, and that's why they're being hammered? This is counting. That was a breakthrough. That was talk about low-lying fruit. This is about as low as it gets.
Yeah.
And of course, the answer was that Black workers were as likely to be members of trade unions as white workers, which automatically, was like basically shut down a whole line of research. So what happened was I wrote the paper, and then I measured the union wage effect for Black workers and for white workers. And if anything, the union wage effect for Black workers is higher than it was for white workers. No surprise in a way, because unions tend to reduce wage differences, income in it. They reduce wage inequality, right? So if you're in a union, you're probably the wage inequality has been reduced, and then the Black guys typically being in the lower skilled jobs, it reduced inequality for them. So what I found was the union wage effect was positive, not negative. And then of course, the way it was done, the rigor of the way I could actually do the analysis was so substantial that it shut down all future research.
Wow. And you never published?
That's a literature that exists, and then it stops. Wow. So nobody knows a thing about the paper.
killed the literature, and then it doesn't get cited anymore.
It was in the Journal of Political Economy. I was very proud of it because I'd sent a copy of it to Greg Lewis, the wonderful labor economist that influenced everybody that did empirical work. He's an incredibly important influence, and he thought it was brilliant, and he actually suggested it to the editor of the JPE. So I had one referee, and he said, "This is great." Bang, that was it. Wow. So it was but it killed the literature. And I always loved that paper. I thought it was a surprise. It was a shock, and the surprise started with the fact that I just counted something.
Right. That's fascinating. That's a great anecdote. Do you feel like that's so if it's not cited very much, then what's going to be the work that you feel like people are going to remember, that you're, what do you think that people are going to sort of stay as their Orley?
Well, I think the training program work, the difference of stuff is probably, if you ask what's foundational, that's probably the most foundational thing, and it influences more than just evaluating. It's now done for everything. So it became in a sense, that's because methodology kind of trumps actual empirical findings.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's kind of a sad story because, if you get an empirical finding, like I did about trade unions, that's quite an important finding for public policy.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get recognized as being very important in the way that Nobel Prizes, for example, are structured.
Right.
I thought it was a little surprising. I was even a little bit surprised. I mean, the way the citation goes for Angrist and Imbens and Card, it leans toward trying to claim there's a methodological advance. Rather than any actual empirical advance.
Right.
But in my mind, I would say that's not really, I thought the Nobel Prize was well-deserved, but mainly because the guys actually do substantive work.
Yeah.
They don't mainly do methods. In fact, I can't really think of any methods that Card invented.
Right. Yeah. No, that's great. Well, I really appreciate this interview. I think it's just such a...
What are you doing with all this stuff, Scott?
Well, I am looking for the story of Princeton. I wrote a book on causal inference earlier last year, and just love history of thought, and taking over the history of thought class at my university, and just want
to. That's great. History of thought. Yeah, I actually did a little work on trying to figure out how many places had it. I don't know if you ever read this. I wrote this review of Sylvia Nasser's book, which she had this second book, not the first book, but the second book.
Oh, okay.
Which was, I think, called The Great Breakthrough or something. I forget exactly. It's a history of thought book, really.
Yeah.
And she got a good advance for it, so that's fine. But it didn't sell anything. And in it, I actually tried to figure out how many history of thought courses still exist.
Yeah.
You should definitely get to know this Netto guy.
I've corresponded with him. His book I hope that dissertation can get turned into a book. It's brilliant. He's going
to be at Duke. I think he might be. He's either going to be at Duke or he is at Duke.
He's going to be on faculty at Duke. They have that history of thought department.
They have. I think he's just visiting. Exactly. I'm not sure. Visiting.
Yeah.
But he is. You should be in touch with him because he will be in the U.S.
Yeah. I will. I was so pleased.
Get him to talk to your class.
That's true. Yeah, I could do that. It would be nice. Since I don't have it prepped yet, I'll have him come teach a couple of lectures.
Yeah, you should actually. He's a very interesting guy.
Yeah.
I've never actually met him. I only saw him on Zoom. But
yeah,
I'm gonna have to leave shortly too.
I don't want to take any more of your time. I'm
talking to a journalist about labor market competition. And, I think that's the low-lying fruit right now, and it's also very shockingly little economic research on it. I mean, the Biden administration is moving ahead of most economists.
Why do you say that?
Well, there's almost no work. I mean, we now have evidence of collusion among, there's the famous Adam Smith quote, employers never get together except to collude to try to suppress wages.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know where he got the evidence. In fact, that would make a great paper. At Smith, I don't know if I use stuff from Smith because he did a lot of labor economics, but he often has built into his stuff empirical material.
Yeah.
But I don't know where it came from.
Yeah.
Well, how did he know that stuff? Right. How did he know? Or he'll have like the famous chapter 10 where he goes through the compensating differentials and he says, explains it. Someone who is in one place gets more money than somewhere. Where does that come from? Right. There's no footnotes, no nothing. Right. I would love to know where, he has this he's got a 4-page section in which he explains that employers are in constant collusion, trying to suppress wages. He never talks about, by the way, competitors trying to collude to increase prices. There's no section about that in there. But there is a section about wages.
It's just about the labor markets?
Yeah, that's the only place where he really talks about collusion. You can, if you haven't got it, I can try to send you the reference to it, but it's in Adam Smith.
Oh,
and I'd love to know where he got this. Where did he get this idea? I mean, it's an empirical statement.
yeah.
So, you know, when I saw some of the stuff that was going on in Silicon Valley with the Silicon Valley, we now know there's all kinds of collusion over wage rates. And that's not even monopsony. that's coordinated behavior. I mean, that's really bad.
Right.
It's certainly illegal. But there are plenty of people who think that it's all wrong, that what the antitrust laws should only be used to help consumers, not workers. What I don't understand that. I mean, consumers are workers.
Right.
We're talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I got to talk to this journalist about. I'm trying to get some. I've been working on this for 30 years, and it's finally getting a little bit of traction, but not much.
Yeah. I only know one I only know one economist, Marshall Steinbaum, that works on this. That's it's really neat. Well, I really appreciate it.
Good talking to you.
It's good talking to you too. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.